Well, good evening. It's good to have you here this evening. It would be better if you don't be back row Baptists. I don't even know how many of you are Baptists, but it would be better if you kind of come at least halfway through. I have a bucket list. I'm 73 years old. My bucket list includes going to Alaska, going to Hawaii, and going on a dinosaur dig. Well, COVID killed I had them scheduled. COVID killed my Hawaii trip. It killed my Alaska trip. I personally, for me, I'm a no-vaxxer in relationship to the COVID-19 thing, so it wasn't until just last week, since Canada dropped it, I will be able to go to Alaska now, and I will be able to go to Hawaii, but haven't got those scheduled. But this man right here, I did get to go on a dinosaur dig, and I had the time of my life. We took a bunch of the young people there, and so this is how I know Tommy Lohman and his wife, paleontologist. It was just a blast for me to be able to get to do that, and Tommy's going to come and share with us. Now, I know many of you have your own churches, but some of you don't have evening services, but he's going to be with us in Sunday school at 9:30. Morning service at 10:45, and the evening service at 6:15. So if you don't have commitments at your own church in the evenings, you'll want to come out, and I expect my own people to be here Sunday school and Sunday morning service. So we'll leave it at that. By the way, there is an offering plate on the back. While I am armed, I'm not going to take any money off of you. So if you'd like to give a love offering, there's on the seat back there. You can make a check out to First Baptist Church if it's a check, but every cent that goes in there is going to go to Tommy and his ministry. He's come a long way to be with us this evening, so I'm going to shut my mouth because I want to hear what he has to say, Tommy. If you'd introduce your wife, please.
Thank you, sir. I'll be glad to.
All right. How's that? That's much better, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. My wife is the love of my life, Martha. Let me just introduce us by telling a story. How about that? Like many of you, I am sure there's been a fascination with dinosaurs since you were children. And I certainly can remember the things that I got, the toys I got as a child. And so I always had that fascination. And it kind of waned as I got into my teenage years. And then the Lord provided an opportunity for us about 10 years ago for us to begin to get into the field of paleontology, to begin to study it in earnest. But Martha told me, she said, I'm just going to come up and just watch you dig. Well, that lasted about 5 minutes. And she has been such a blessing to me, and we have partnered together in this ministry, in this work that the Lord has given us to do through these 10 plus years. And so I'm thankful for her work and her care and her investment into what we do. And so much of what we do now is to extend into opportunities like this. Some of you, we were talking earlier about coming up and digging, and I hope you will come up and at least see our museum. We're in Glendive, Montana. But I know some of you are saying, I'm never going to do that. And so it's my honor and privilege to be able to bring this to you here tonight in moments like this. But I also know that so often the field of paleontology is a field that's very secular, very anti-God in its constructs. And I believe that actually dinosaurs are still, by and large, one of those untapped resources, untapped evidences of God as creator of all things. Now, I'm not going to bore you tonight with all of those details. We'll do that tomorrow night, okay? But there's such fascination when you get to really dig these bones out of the ground, and you see the little details, and you begin to be reminded that these were creatures, these were animals that once walked the face of this planet. They were created by God, and while we might have questions that might spin around them, we understand these basic fundamental principles. Nothing exists without the hand of God, and he spoke all things into existence. And that's an affirmation. That is a thing that we can hold to clearly and decidedly. Now, as far as our work, we live in Tennessee during the off season, if you will, and spend our summers in Montana. You guys put a little arrow there to kind of give you a point of reference. Glendive, Montana is on the eastern edge of the state. We're out in the middle of ranch country. Some farming goes on up there. There's quite a bit of dinosaur activity that's up there, and so we're happy to be part of that journey. Now, we also have, this is our museum. We have a 20,000 square foot museum, and we present our exhibits in the context of biblical history. We open up Genesis 1 and we read, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we take that as the beginning of literal history in which God transcends time. And so we tell people that as soon as they walk in the door. We get some strange looks on people's faces when they think they're walking into a dinosaur museum, but they don't understand the biblical element. And some people, I won't bother you with stories tonight, but we're thankful for the opportunity to make these kinds of declarations. Amen. The inside of our museum, this is our main exhibit hall. You see now, one of the things I want to kind of be sure that you understand is so much of what dinosaur museums of all kinds present is if you see a full skeleton, to one degree or another, you're seeing cast. You're not seeing complete bone. What you see in this exhibit right here is most of this is cast. Now, we are working on a Triceratops, which I'll talk about after a while. And we're working on this Triceratops. We call him Big John. He's an extremely big animal, and we hope to have him over the next couple of years fully up and articulated and standing up for people to come and see. This is another picture, another angle of the Tyrannosaur. This is taken after the Tyrannosaur called Stan, and this one was some 65% complete. Black Hills Institute created this cast. They've sold well over 100 of them in their time and their work. We also have dinosaurs such as the Pachycephalosaur, the dome-headed dinosaurs where you think they may have actually done headbutting. We have the Ankylosaur, which is one of the coolest little animals that you ever could see with all the spikes and the club tail. My personal favorite is the Triceratops, the three-horned. We have some fossils over here. And then there's some people who still like the T-Rex, and that's okay. T-Rexes are cool. This is a T-Rex that is sticking out the front of our building, and this kind of grabs people's attention. And we're happy for them to come in and share and see. This is the other theropod that's in our museum exhibit. This is called an Acrocanthosaur. This is a high-spined lizard. It is in the same kind with the Tyrannosaurids, but it has some unique features about it. Now, as I mentioned, we do our exhibits, our digs, all that we do in the context of biblical history. We see that over 6 days, God created life. On the 6th day, he created land animals. And people will ask, how do you know where dinosaurs would fit in? And in a nutshell, we recognize that dinosaurs are land animals, and we see the 6th day of creation, God has created land animals, and so we make a logical conclusion that day 6 was the day in which God created dinosaurs amongst all the other land animals. Now, we are not ignorant to the fact that that flies in the face of what is typically taught. But we build our thinking off of a biblical worldview, and we build our science on top of that. We are not anti-scientific at all. But we do believe that science needs its proper anchor, and the Bible gives us this foundation. Now, as we look at a paleontologist is a scientist who studies the history of life through the fossil record. Now, I'll tell you what, there's some days that's kind of easy, and there's some days that's kind of challenging, you know? Because none of the bones have any tags. They don't have any information with them. They're always found in the present, and they require an interpretation. And so that's part of the journey that we're always going through. Now, as a paleontologist, we also recognize the need to be diverse in our thinking, to understand many different disciplines. We need to have some sense of what a biologist would think about as we understand the function of life and how living organisms function and move. We need to understand the genetics as we understand getting down to the DNA and what does gene information produce and how can we see that expressed as we see in Genesis 1, life was created after its kind. Well, there are genetic implications for that one statement. We need to have a sense of being a geologist as we can read the ground and the layers that we look at. We need to be able to kind of anticipate what an engineer would see and think and study, because we're trying to understand how bones fit together and how these living organisms would move. And having a sense of engineering is going to be a key part of that. And then we need to have a sense of historian. For me personally, I find the Bible as really the best source of history that there is. It sits before me, and in the beginning, God created sense, and it unfolds history in a way, and I don't find any compromise in my scientific pursuits because I have set the Bible before me in history. And so these things are key as I think as a paleontologist. As I think about why we do what we do, we're mindful that the world, as we look at the world, it bears the marks of water moving across the earth. We see layers, we see canyons carved, we see the burial of life. These are all evidences of water, however you might interpret that. Now, the Bible gives us an account of a lot of water. We read in Genesis 6, 5, and 7, talks about the wickedness of mankind and that God was going to judge this wickedness. He says, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land. As we move into the next chapter, we see in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Now, this gives us little bits of geological insight. We're not trying to write a geology paper here. We're not trying to do a full scientific research project simply off this narrative, but this narrative is critical. Because what we see in the world, and we have an accounting of history here from Scripture, those two must correlate in some capacity. And so we understand that when we look at the fountains of the great deep bursting forth as an example, that means something under the earth's crust happened. But when we look at the earth itself, we recognize that the continents have been divided and spread apart. We need a mechanism for that continent dividing activity to occur. Historically, we see this recorded here in Genesis chapter 7. And so we're always working, for me, I'm always working with what does the Bible give me as history? What am I seeing in the field? And how can I integrate those two ways of thinking rightly and properly? This may kind of give you a sense. I ran across this video from Answers in Genesis. It's called The Flood Initiation. And it basically starts with how the flood might have looked. It's a concept, but it takes the initiation of the flood itself and takes you right up to the God closing the door on the ark. So let's watch this real quick. The Bible tells us that the water increased until the whole earth was inundated with water, until the high mountains were covered. We should not understand this as to be the Himalayas, Mount Everest, for they were post-flood formed, but whatever high peaks there would have been at that time, they would have been covered here. We see that all life has perished. And so Noah and his family and the animals that God had sent to the ark, and I believe included the dinosaurs, would have been on the ark and survived the flood. There's an important point I want to make sure we understand at this juncture. I am fascinated by the dinosaurs that we see, and I enjoy studying them. But all of them are found buried, broken, destroyed, ripped apart. Something happened. And this kind of event is not localized to where we dig in Montana. This is literally all over the planet. Bears this kind of testimony of catastrophe. And I think this flood account that Scripture gives us is a very solid explanation for what we see in the world itself. And so what I'm reminded of is that the fossils under our feet, is we're walking on a graveyard every day. Now for me, some of us might look and see the fossils as something to a distant past, something that happened a long time ago. But if we understand Scripture correctly here, these fossils, this is evidence that God judges sin. Because if these fossils are in the ground as a result of a global flood, this global flood came about because of the sin of humanity. And these aren't just interesting features, interesting animals to look at, but they should remind us that even within the earth itself, there's testimony that's born there. The ark made its way through the flood. And as we come to our work, and I want to walk through some things that we do on our summers, when it's 105 degrees and we're just baking, we enjoy our experiences. We enjoy getting to work with people and teach and share. Fulfill childhood dreams, Pastor. Bucket list, right? Amen to that? So our work is we start our mornings taking people up to our dig site. We work them up Rattlesnake Run. Then we get up to the dig site and we're looking for fossils. We're looking for something called float. See, all the layers that we have, the hills that we have are layers that they're stratified, and so we're looking for particular layers. And in these layers are these fossils, and these fossils are laid down flat, and as the ground exposes them, they start to break apart and crumble, and they float down to the flat spot, and so we're looking for bones. Now let me run a test here. I think y'all can pass this test. There is one bone in this picture. Do you see it? I gave you a second, see if you can find it. Because this is really the trick. People are like, how do you see that stuff? It all looks the same. And we're like, no, it doesn't. Bones and rocks look way different. But it takes a little time to kind of get your brain kind of wrapped around that. That's the bone right there. Now, you all knew that, right? Every one of you had that nailed, I'm sure. We had some smiles that day on these two young men. They pulled out a rib about what is it, 15 inches long, 12 inches long. As we get through and we are doing our digging, as we're looking for bone, we're looking for that level, as I talked about, and when we find something, we start working in on it. And so this particular site, I started down below and began to work my way up the hill, and I found this one bone sticking out about the size of my fist. Now, typically that is you dig it out and you're done. We've been digging on this spot for 6 years. We dig in, we dig down. We need strong young men who are willing to swing a pick and a shovel. Any volunteers tonight? And so we see the bone layer, but we've got to move the sediment around. And as we get closer, we're continually pushing that wall back, that overburden, trying to get that out of the way so that we can get down to that bone layer. Now, this particular site has a great variety of things. We're not digging on one skeleton in this particular spot. We're digging on parts of Triceratops, T-Rex, Ankylosaurs, crocodilians, fish, turtles. Oh, God loved turtles. I assure you of that. He must have loved turtles because he made so many of them, because we're always finding turtles. And then we find these young men, as I mentioned before, and sometimes an older guy gets in there, and we enjoy going through the work of rolling rocks down the hill. We're still boys. At almost 60 years of age, yes, Pastor, at almost 60 years of age, I still enjoy watching a big rock roll down a hill. It just kind of works. But we enjoy the camaraderie and the teamwork as we recognize what we're trying to get to a layer, get to the fossils so that people like yourselves can come and enjoy that experience. But don't you think for a moment that just guys love to roll rocks down the hill? You did. I did. That's my wife right there. She loves it too. Yes, you can thank me later. And so this is part of the camaraderie, the teamwork that we enjoy out here. And when we get to a bone of some size, like this Triceratops femur, what we're looking to do is we want to keep it in place. We want to protect it. We're managing. We know that there's some level of breakage involved. We're managing that process, but we've got to get it out of the ground. And so we're digging down below the lowest point of the bone and begin to work underneath. And when we're satisfied with that we were at that point, then we start with a roll of aluminum foil. Now, I can't tell you how many times I've heard somebody say that that looks like a baked potato. But we've heard that many times. But this provides us the first level of protection and structure for the bone. And then we come back with simple burlap bags, plaster, water. And we start dipping these burlap bags into this plaster mix and start creating a shell. Basically, if you've ever had a broken bone and you've had a cast on your arm or leg, you understand the process. And this is what we're doing in the field. Once that sets up, then we roll it over, and then we usually get the strongest person who's capable to carry it out. Unfortunately, that often winds up being me, so I could use some of you strong, strapping young men. I'm kind of evaluating some of you guys right now. Now, this is another project we get to work on where the Triceratops Sacrum, it's part of the hips. You'll see the two ilium, the two big flat bones, and the pieces in the middle. And as we're working here, we've already got the ilium or the sacrum already wrapped. These young ladies are helping with the process. Part of what we ran into was some ribs and some of the hip bones in there as well. It was really an interesting project, seeing all of the bones kind of jumbled together. And we were able to get this guy down, put him on a stretcher, and got him back to the lab. And this young man here began to help me this summer working on getting it prepped and cleaned up. It's interesting when you think about excavation, it can be a slow process depending on what you're working on. Let's just say you've got 4 hours tied up in a bone. But depending on its condition, you might have 10, 12, 20 hours in its prep. And that can be an interesting thing to kind of be mindful of, that as you evaluate these projects, how do I prioritize certain things? Because we're always looking to try to get things out on display. And as you can see here, this is kind of getting down to the final result, and we were able to get this guy out in front of people and the ribs there on the left for people to see. But I think we had close to 150 man-hours of prep time in the lab on just what you see laying there on the ground. And so it takes time. And so when you hear of somebody prepping something and get it on display, they've likely had it for several years. And so we enjoy the relationships that we get to build. Tim and his family have been one of them. Pastor, we thank you for getting to come up. where we enjoy these times to build. But once we get through that process of field work and get the fossil back to the lab, we begin the process of prep. We use a microjack, a micron blaster, dental picks. We're trying to always be mindful of finding the right tool for the right situation as we clean and prep. What you see here in particular, this table represents all bones that have been prepped by us in our lab. And as we get down, we invite people to come and share that experience. People who've got a good sense of putting puzzles together, a good sense of how things are ordered and structured. We get to share these kinds of things with these people. And so here's just a few of these moments that we've been able to share. Does that look familiar? We'll just talk later, okay? She got to work on this particular bone right off the bat, right? What's interesting about this one, well, let me save it. This is in the lab here. Now, you start, usually, if you show up in our lab, you're going to start with a dental pick. Now, that can be a good thing because that gives you a sense of really just being able to discern what's dirt and what's bone. And sometimes that's harder than you might think, depending on what condition it's in. Now, this particular bone was the bone that we were just showing, and the next summer, I was able to get it prepped and got down to this point. And I recognized that what we were seeing here are not just dents in the bone, but these are bite marks. And of the size of the bite marks, we believe that this might be a Tyrannosaurus rex that bit this. This is a Triceratops thoracic vertebra. It's a fairly big one, and it was complete, but it looks like the T-Rex was biting on it after it probably had died, and find that to be a really intriguing thing to consider the idea of predation in the fossil record. We use this micron blaster. Can I get a cheer for this family here? And so Tim, you and your family appreciate you coming up and getting to share. I didn't really think about you being in these pictures, but I was glad to be able to make this connection for us here. And what they were doing here is they were working on using this machine here. This is a micron blaster. This is a Tyrannosaurus rex tibia. And this is kind of the last line of prep. As we've cleaned things up, we've gotten the big chunks of dirt off, we began to glue things together. We're wanting to kind of get that fine, clean finish on the bone so that we can eventually put a sealer on it and be done with it. And this is a slow process. Another tool that we use here is this microjack. When pieces get very hard, this is a tedious tool to work with, but you can get a lot of precision. It gives a lot of bang for the buck, so to speak, as you're working through things. So let me just stop here for just a second. Are there any questions that you want to ask regarding what you've just seen, the field work and the lab work? Yes, sir.
You said off-season is winter, actual season is summer?
Yes, sir.
Where does that run from?
Basically, we're June, July, and August is our dig season. Part of that is our own personal schedule. Is we live in Tennessee, so we need to get back at some point. We could probably stretch that a little bit further, but we do June, July, and August.
What are your days look like as far as like early to evening?
We're between 7 and usually we're out by 7 and try to get in, depending on how the temperature of the day is, by anywhere from 2 to 4 in the afternoon. Anybody else?
What is the white stuff? Is that like salt or whatever on the outside of the fossil, like the very top layer?
It was a really solid white.
Not pretty solid.
That should be the plaster
Oh, okay.
that when we wrapped it in a field jacket.
I think it was when you were still, when,
She's talking about the matrix.
Oh, that's just the color of the sandstone that was attached to the bone. Okay. Yes, ma'am. probably about 15 minutes. Okay? All right, let me press on just a little bit further unless somebody else has a question. I just thought I'd, yes, ma'am. How do they move while they're walking? Well, God made dinosaurs in such a way that he gave them really strong bones with really big muscles, and those muscles are strong enough to move their bones. And so they can do what they're supposed to do because God created them to do that, okay? Okay. All right, when you think about the idea of understanding dinosaurs from a biblical worldview, I've always been intrigued by the idea of that. I remember when I first started studying creation apologetics. You know, it's conceptually we can make the argument that they were created on the sixth day of creation, but why do we not really see a dinosaur in the Bible itself?
Because there's so many animals. I mean, if you had to mention every animal, I mean,
It'd take a lot of writing, it would. When we think about a couple of things, one is the word dinosaur itself was not coined until 1841. And I know we know what year the King James Version Bible was released. It was 1611. So when KJV was written, the word dinosaur was not present. Okay? So if the Bible is going to make reference to dinosaurs, it's not going to use the word dinosaur to make description. It may use the word beast as an example. But one of the words I really found intriguing was the idea of behemoth. Now, I'm not going to give you much here. This is more of just kind of wetting the whistle, so to speak, right now, because this is my talk for tomorrow night, is to really to understand what is behemoth. And I believe what we're looking at here is this description is what we would call a sauropod. A sauropod, let's just do a visual here. Does this look familiar? This is a sauropod. I believe this is behemoth. This is what I believe God is given to Job as a visual example of his power and his majesty. And there's a lot of interesting details that we can extract from just understanding this. This is tomorrow night. But even as we think about looking at them just for a moment here, how did they move? How did they breathe? Simple things of how did they go down and get a drink of water? How did they eat? These are some questions I want to try to answer for us tomorrow night as we kind of get a little more technical, a little more paleontology, a little more dinosaur, but we're going to do so with the understanding of a biblical worldview behind us. And so these are some pictures here of what you might think of. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about Triceratops with some of you, just by a show of hands. Do we have any Triceratops fans in the room in here tonight? A couple of them? Yeah. I'm so thankful for you people because when I go to Montana at the museum, I run into a lot of T-Rex people that just love T-Rexes, and I'm just a Triceratops person, okay? But they're fascinating creatures when you think about how they're structured, their heads. Triceratops means three-horn face. There's a great deal of variety in how their horns are shaped. Their frill, which is the big skirt in the back, their nose horn, there's interesting variety that God has built into the genetics of these animals. As I mentioned, this is the Triceratops in the exhibit on our museum. This is a cast, but it's, again, a fascinating look at these animals. As we look at these animals here, get this screen here. This is what we call a brow horn. Your brow is here, right over your eye. And so the Triceratops would have two horns over his eye. This is This is a cast. This is a replica here. This thick part here would sit right into the skull, and this would protrude out. There are grooves, if you'll notice the grooves that run along with the bone itself. Those are called blood grooves. So those would be blood vessels that would sit on the surface of the bone, and little capillaries would then feed into the bone itself to keep it alive. Then a layer of keratin would be over this. There's a lady we dig with on the ranch, and she was telling us that cattle, that their horns, the core is only about half the length of the horn itself. And so she was using that analogy to think about Triceratops horns. This is basically the core. This is not the keratin outer shell. And so if this is 2 feet long, what you would have seen when it had been alive might have been 4 or 5 feet long and come to a point. It had been quite an impressive looking animal, to say the least. As we think about the skull and the details here, the frill, which is this skirt bone around the edge, can be anywhere from, say, 1 to 3 inches thick. It has a nice rolled edge at the top, and there are little pieces of bone that kind of protrude out. Some of them can be very subtle. Some of them can be almost horn-like. Epicypitals is what they're called. And they have different shapes, as I mentioned, but they're there basically to guard the neck and the front part of the shoulders. God has designed them with this capacity. A few years ago, we got to see a Triceratops skull in the ground. This is a complete skull right here. The only things missing are the brow horns. And you can see I'm at the back, I'm at the frill. So there's the frill. Brow horns are right here. This is a picture I took from right above. This is on the skull cap. This is where the brow horns would be. You see them broken off. And then this picture is the frill itself. If you'll notice the lines, again, we see the blood grooves that would have sat on the surface of the bone. The average size Triceratops is probably 20 to 28 feet long, 6 to 9 feet in height. I may have mentioned earlier a Triceratops we started to work on called Big John. We think Big John is actually going to be an exceptionally large Triceratops. We think his size is going to be more like this. We think at his hips, he may be 11, 12 feet tall at the hips. Now, this is not a standing up 2-legged dinosaur. This is a 4-legged animal. And then he might be as much as 35 feet long. And so when you compare him to an average size T-Rex, he's not a lot smaller, is he? Now, I'm not saying T-Rexes didn't get much bigger than this. I think they may have. But on an average size T-Rex, Big John would have been comparable. And so he would have been a formidable animal to deal with for anybody. This is Big John as he sits today. Not quite as impressive, I agree. And this is what we're working through, is we're working through prepping each and every bone, getting it cleaned up, create a metal frame so that we can sit the animal inside of it. This is his nose horn here. Some prep work I was doing this past summer on the nose horn, as I may have mentioned. And so as we look at these animals, there are some really unique and interesting details that can come out. I'm not going to try to bore you with a bunch of extra information tonight. But what I see here is some fascinating animals, interesting details, interesting function, immense size often, unique features, and all things point to the glory of God and his creative hand in this world. And that's my testimony. That's what I stand upon. That's the work we do. We do this science in theology merged together. I'll be glad to take a few minutes of questions if you have some. Otherwise, this will conclude our time. So,
Now, I'm going to have my grandson bring a microphone because this is going live stream. So if you have a question, Nate, take her the microphone.
we got one up here. Right there. Right here. Right here. Yeah.
I was just recently reading that some people think that the behemoth was a rhinoceros. So, I mean, so why, I mean, how do you feel that it's not? Brachiosaurus or whatever, as opposed to.
So
something
why do I feel that Behemoth is not a rhinoceros?
Yeah.
Okay. I would say the ideas of rhinoceros came largely because years ago when they were beginning to try to determine what behemoth might be, they were trying to come up with known animals of strength. And so they did not consider extinct animals. And so they were considering things like elephants, hippopotamus, and rhino became to the surface. When we look at, and this is what I'm going to touch on more tomorrow night, but when we look at the anatomical description of what's going on there with respect to things like the tail, there's not sufficient information that points to a rhino. It points to something grander, something bigger, and really something different. So that's kind of the short answer to that. Okay? Who else? Right here.
Thank you. This is all fascinating. I've loved dinosaurs ever since I was little, and now my little grandson, 5, we play dinosaurs together, so
Cool,
it's
cool.
great. But everybody has a different timeline for this, so what do you say? How many years ago did these dinosaurs live and walk this earth?
Great question. Great question. What I do is I take the Bible's timeline as a framework. As an example, genealogies at Genesis 5, genealogies at Genesis 11. I come in the timelines of Kings. There's other key data points throughout Scripture that give me an idea of how long the Old Testament stretched. And what I understand is that what we're digging up are from the flood itself. And so what I'm trying to date is not so much the dinosaur per se, but when did the flood occur? And so when I look at that, we're looking at about 2,400 years ago BC. And so we're roughly 2,000 years today. So we're looking at 4,500 years ago, dinosaurs died out in the flood. Now, I do believe there were some dinosaurs after the flood, and we really see that in so much of the artwork, but ultimately, I believe they enter into a world that was changing, that they were not able to keep up with and maintain, and ultimately went extinct. And some of those things that drove that extinction of dinosaurs has to do not so much with the bones, but the soft tissue that isn't preserved anymore. And so it makes it a little bit difficult to nail down. They didn't respond to disease A as an example because we don't have the data to be able to support that. But to answer your question directly, I would say 44 to 4,500 years ago, dinosaurs died out and the fossil record was established.
Not
Not
Years
millions and millions. My approach to Genesis chapter, let's just answer that. The idea of millions of years was brought into mainstream culture about 200 years ago. The gentleman, one of the key gentlemen that did that, his objective was really to minimize the Genesis account. And what he did is he began to dismiss the Bible as real history and began to promote a scientific perspective. Now, I doubt his motives in that process, but what we begin to see is the earth begin to get older in the minds of scientists in that flow. Because what they begin to do is interpret the data in light of an evolutionary model. God didn't create things supernaturally complete and complex as the Bible teaches, but what they saw is a more naturalistic worldview that progressed over millions of years. And so that idea began to take root even in the church. And what happens is, when you look at all of these key data points that I was just mentioning regarding a young earth, you can't put millions of years anywhere in the Old Testament, anywhere, but where it wound up was in the Genesis 1 account. And so what I've heard for years is day doesn't really mean day. God really wasn't creating over 6 literal days. God can do whatever he wants. And my approach is the text is historic narrative, and it is telling me exactly what God did, even if it doesn't tell me the details that I may always want it to tell me. And I'm not limiting God. God is telling me what he did. I'm not limiting God's communication. So when I look at millions of years, I don't see any biblical possibility for that. Further, the fossil record winds up getting put into the week of creation. Now, this is death that we just read from Genesis, that God saw the wickedness of man and he judged the sin with a global flood. But if that happened in the week of creation, that means that happened before sin entered into the world. We've got a theological problem. An impossible theological problem. Further, science does not demand an old earth. It does not. In fact, there are evidences that the scientific community will easily dismiss that are valid, the presence of carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. Carbon-14 is a thing, as a living being, we're always processing this carbon-14. And when we die, we stop taking it in and it starts to break down. It is believed through mathematical calculations that carbon-14 will basically zero out in 50,000 years. So if dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago, how much carbon-14 should you ever find in a dinosaur bone? Think about it. Is it even close? No. And yet, we have 3 bones in our collection in our museum that have been sent to independent labs, all with carbon-14 in them. Soft tissue in dinosaur bones, red blood cells, blood vessels that are stretchy. Every secular scientist recognizes that these things should not be present. These things should be solidified, and yet they're present. Again, suggesting an alternative idea of timeline. It's these kinds of ideas that we as, if you will, young earth creationists approach this type of thing with dinosaurs and say they must be reinterpreted regarding their timeline. Because the Bible nor science supports deep time. That's my long answer.
So we can assume when God created Adam and Eve, the dinosaurs were already here and they were riding around on them, or?
I don't know how much riding went on, but yes, ma'am, they were here and coexisted. They were created on the same day.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. Those questions have been in my mind for years.
Thank you for asking.
So thank you. Thank you.
Who else?
What is the most common bone that you usually find?
Oh, there's 2. A vertebra, which is part of your backbone, and the ribs. Do you know why? Because those are the most of them in an animal. That's a good question, but those are the most common ones. We have some vertebrae and ribs over here if you haven't checked them out, okay? Who else? Thank you all for coming tonight. Amen. I trust it was encouragement to you. You are an encouragement to me if you have other questions. Pastor, you want to close? Yes, ma'am.
So then,
Go ahead.
were all the dinosaurs at the same time, or like you have those different eras of of the dinosaurs, so were every kind of dinosaur then really there at the same time?
Oh, sometimes when I take a breath, I'm like, how long of an answer am I going to give you?
Just yes or no.
Okay. Well, I don't ever do that. Yes, they would have lived all at the same time. There are caveats to that in that dinosaurs have species variations that would be distributed across the planet. We're going to find different kinds of turtles on 2 different sides of the planet today, different kinds of iguanas. They're going to have different features, so we might see them as different progressions of life, and yet they're living at the same time, just in a different place. So we might see that similarity, but they would have lived fundamentally at the same time.
In a short answer, can you geologic column versus order of variance, because that's where you're getting that layering.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, then, can the dinosaurs have, is there evidence that they mutated from one type of animal that, fed one way, and then we mutated? Is there a span of era that could track?
Yeah, I'm going to come to here because that's actually going to feed in together. I'll answer your question here in just a second. When you think about living organisms, God created life during the week of creation, and He created it, first of all, it tells us He created flyers, He created swimmers, He created land animals, and He created crawlers, and He created humanity. And it gives us kind of a broad scope look. But it says also He created after their kind. And He doesn't say that about humans, but He says that about the animals. We take that to understand is that God would have created, as an example, the Tyrannosaurus rex kind, but from that original created kind, He would have had a full range of genetic information contained within him at creation that could have been expressed slightly differently by his offspring. And some of that could have been driven by environment. Some of that could have been driven by genetic mutations. Some of that just simply could have been driven by just how God had created particulars. So with respect to variety of life, there is an incredible amount of genetic variety within groups of animals. But what we do not ever see is one group or one kind of animals becoming any other kind of animal. Yeah. And so your question's valid, and we can see some interesting transitions in variety within a kind, but we don't ever see the kind of large-scale leaps that evolution, Darwinian evolution, teaches us. And that's really not even just me saying it because I'm a Christian. That's really, we can demonstrate that scientifically. And so we understand that concept. And so with respect to how that might play out in the fossil record, this becomes a little bit of trying to interpret what we're seeing. I see, like the Tyrannosaurus kind, I'll see Tyrannosaurus rex in Montana. I'll hear of an Albertosaurus in Alberta, Canada. I'll hear of a Dipletosaurus in South America. I'll hear of a Tarborosaurus in China. That sounds like 4 different things, doesn't it? But those are really slight variations of the same created kind, but geographically they're distributed differently over the planet. So what the geological column assumes is that evolution is a thing that happens. The paleontologists assume evolution happens, and they're always stacking life in this progression. They don't ever explain how one kind comes to another. They just tell you it happens. And I don't see that way. I see this at what paleontologists have access to is this great database of which they don't really know how to interpret it accurately. Because what the Genesis 1 model says after its kind is telling us there is diversity within life, but it is bounded by how much diversity it can have. So what the fossil record gives us is it gives us ecosystems. So we'll go to our Hell Creek Formation and we'll see particular organisms, dinosaurs, fish, crocs. Then you can go across Montana and you can get into a Judith River formation and see something different. You can go to South America and you're going to see another ecosystem. But that's not progression of evolution. Those are the burial, that is the record of burial that the flood grabbed different ecosystems all over the planet. But as an evolutionist, a paleontologist, they've assumed evolution happens, and so they're going to interpret the data differently. But I don't think that's a sound way to interpret it, because the fundamental idea of what they're claiming is that everything has come from a common ancestor and diversified. And if you look at what's called the phylogenetic tree, where it splits, there's nothing ever here. Never. Yes, ma'am. Did I answer both of you ladies' questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was thinking, there's, as far as species to species, in order to make a new species, generally, if you breed two different species, their progeny will be sterile. Like when you breed a horse and a donkey, you get a mule, or Jenny or whatever, and they are sterile. They cannot reproduce their own kind. But according to climate and people and animals needing, a red fox is not going to live very long in Alaska, whereas a white one might live better there. So the ecosystems play into that. So, so that's where the diversity comes. That's why we have hundreds of different kinds of dogs, hundreds of different kinds of cats, hundreds of different lizards. But they don't, it's still by its kind. You're not breeding a dog and a cat.
Which is the beauty of what we see is that God has done with creation, is He has created life in such a way that it can find ways to adapt to different environments. That's not illogical or rational, but that's not evolution. I would say, do I believe that life changes and has variation in it? Yeah, I believe that. Do I believe in evolution? I do not. But part of what we fight here is terminology. Because to an evolutionist, and this is why I try to encourage Christians to recognize this, if you just simply respond to an evolutionist as an example and just say, well, evolution's dumb, you're missing what they're really fundamentally trying to communicate. Because what they believe is that everything that changes falls into the category of evolution. And as a creationist, I recognize some of it is change does occur, just not the kind, scope, or scale that they claim. And so it's so much of the semantics of dialogue and clarifying terminology that we must be attentive to as we engage with people. Good questions, thank you.
I just wanted to say, the geologic column only exists in textbooks. They'll find dinosaurs and they'll find trilobites in the same strata supposedly that, Cambrian, Precambrian, all that kind. It's only in textbooks. It's
You say that, can I, one more point?
Yeah. Go ahead.
There's a German paleontologist who is now kind of more of an intelligent design guy. I won't call him a Christian or creationist. Gunther Beckley. And what we believe is that the Bible is teaching that life has arisen spontaneously, when it says God created the flyers. Whatever diversity He built into that, they came and they were flying immediately. They had the capacity to exist and live. So when we look at the fossil record, they have the Cambrian is supposed to be the bottom level, and yet when you look at the Cambrian rock layer, there's an incredible amount of diversity that's there. But what's interesting is if you go just below the Cambrian, there's no evidence, no predecessors of any of those upper layer animals. In fact, Gunter Beckley makes the statement that not only is the Cambrian a picture of spontaneous generation of life, but there are 17 such events he's identified in the fossil record where a group of organisms all of a sudden just appears. That sounds like spontaneous creation.
Amen.
So I just wanted to, since we were on that, I wanted to share that with you. Go ahead, Pastor.
Much for coming, and he'll stick around a little bit to come and look at the fossils that are here. We appreciate your coming. If you don't have services tomorrow, Sunday school 9:30, morning service 10:45, and then the evening service, you got to see he's going to explain the Behemoth thing and the physiology of all. It's going to be exciting. Dragons, Leviathan, all kinds of stuff. So you might want to come if you don't have a commitment. There is an offering plate in the back if you want to drop something in there. It's free. You don't have to. We'll make sure that they get taken care of. I'm going to have a word of prayer and then let you be dismissed. By the way, out on my own books table, there's a dozen Where the Dinosaur Came From publications when I taught through it in Sunday school 2 years ago. So they're out there if you're interested. Let's pray. Been a great evening. Thank you for Tommy and thank you for his wife for beautiful display, and how thankful we are for men of their quality who can answer our questions. And Lord, we love you. We're thankful for who you are. Be with us now as we go our separate ways. In Jesus' name we do pray. Amen. God bless you. Thanks. You're dismissed.